So let's talk about Hagar. Normally, when we hear about Hagar, it's in connection to her story with Abraham and Sarah. And so, of course, God came to Abraham and he said, Hey, I'm going to give you a lot of blessings. And a part of those blessings is going to be that you're going to have so many descendants that you won't be able to count them. And so, Abraham was trying to figure out how that's going to work because not only was he older, but also his wife was older and she had never been able to give birth to children. And so, with that, we normally hear the story told where Sarah, this gracious wife, decides to go help her husband out, make sure he can get this blessing. And so she gives her slave, Hagar, to Abraham. And we often hear it being said that Hagar became Abraham's wife. And eventually Hagar becomes pregnant, and that is when she and Sarah run into some issues. And I've often heard it taught that Hagar started to feel herself, and that's when Sarah decided to go ahead and assert her dominance again. Hagar felt away because she had stepped out of line. And so that's when she runs away. God sends her back. Eventually, Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. And because Hagar is such a bad woman who feels herself and wants to be more important than she is, Hagar and Ishmael become mean to not only Sarah, but they're also Ishmael's mean to Sarah's son, Isaac. And so that's why they have to be sent away, because Hagar's created all this tension in the family dynamic. And so now Abraham has to send Hagar and Ishmael off into the wilderness to save the family that he has, the legitimate family, with Sarah and with Isaac. And so as I was reading through a couple of texts, two books in particular, The Texts of Terror and No Crystal Stair, I started to re-examine how I was viewing Hagar's narrative. And those two books helped me to reshape how I see the text and how I see Hagar's story. So today I'm going to talk about three things that I learned in reshaping and reframing Hagar's narrative. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is examining the power dynamic between Hagar and Sarah. And so, at least for me, one of the things that was a little confusing was seeing Hagar referenced as Abraham's wife. And I know that a lot of times when it was being taught, it would continue to be taught as if she was his wife throughout the entire process. However, when I went back to the text and I started to re-examine what the text was telling me, I really became keenly aware of the fact that Hagar was always Sarah's property. When we start to look at Sarah formulating this plan to help get a baby to start her family, she is going to start her family by using Hagar's body. Hagar's not in that discussion. Hagar is the subject of the discussion, but no one speaks to her. She has never given her consent to this process because, again, she's not given full humanity in this narrative because she is someone's property. And so she is not Abraham's wife in the sense that Sarah is Abraham's wife. She's not a wife in the contemporary sense that we would think about it, but she is really more like a concubine, or now Abraham's property, or property that's being loaned out for the purpose of starting a family for Sarah. And so in that dynamic, you continue to see how you have those moments where she's referred to as a wife, but she will continue to come back as the narrative will continue to call her Sarah's slave. And so as I started to think about that power dynamic and I started to compare it to the American chattel slavery that happened, and thinking about all of the stories and the dynamics of the slaves who would be impregnated by their masters, and how sometimes in modern retellings of the story, they'll call it a love story. They'll call it, something beautiful. But in fact, there was no beauty in it. There could be no love because there was never any choice. That slave was the property of her master. She couldn't have consented to that because she doesn't have the autonomy to do so. And where there is no choice, there is no love. So as I continue to think about that and compare it to Hagar's narrative and be able to reframe how I saw this situation that she was put in by Sarah, that she didn't have a choice in, and now she's been put in this very tense situation where she has been able to conceive a child, which is something that her owner was not able to do. And yes, she does acknowledge that, and that does, have her feeling away. But we also very quickly see the power dynamics come back as Abraham gives Sarah permission to regain control however she sees fit. And we see that the text tells us that Sarah begins to afflict Hagar. And it's not an afflict in the way that, again, I've often heard it taught as if, two women squabbling and, Sarah was just kind of cold and mean to Hagar. But when you really look into what the Hebrew word means, it's talking about to oppress, to be violent towards, to humiliate, to do the same kind of oppression that we'll see when the Hebrews are in bondage in Egypt. It's trauma. She is bringing trauma onto Hagar. And so, with that being said, that has helped reshape and reframe the power dynamics between Sarah and between Hagar as I continue to look at the story as it unfolds. And so that brings me to point number 2. So when I continue to look at the story, I also notice that Hagar is one of the first women where God comes and she speaks a promise directly to her, not through Abraham. And so in the affliction that Sarah has decided to bring on to Hagar, we see that Hagar takes off. She's like, okay, well, let's start talking about self-preservation. I have to get out of here. The wilderness has to be better than this. So as she flees into the wilderness, the angel of the Lord comes to her and he again reminds her that she is Sarah's slave. And then he asks her, like, what are you doing? What's going on? And in that, he makes a promise that she is going to have so many descendants that they will not be able to be counted. And that mirrors the same promise that we see being given to Abraham, because of course, she is pregnant with Abraham's child. But with that promise, with this incredible moment of God connecting with this woman, we also see that that promise comes with a lot of really traumatic things. He is, number one, not only reminding her that she's a slave, but he also tells her to go back to her oppressor. He tells her to go back to the same person who's abusing her. He also says that while, yes, you're going to have all of these descendants, your son is going to have incredible abundance, but his abundance is going to be met with and coupled with isolation and desolation. He's going to have conflict all of his life. And so you see these very two extremes that Hagar is trying to navigate between of, yes, I'm God and I'm speaking to you and what an incredible experience. But at the same time, I'm also telling you, go back to the person who's harmed you. I'm reminding you that you are not that man's wife. You are his wife's slave. And that, yes, your son is going to have abundance, but it's going to come with all of these really painful experiences too. So as I continue to push through the text and I move into the last item, the last thing that I want to share with you all today. So the last thing I'm going to talk about comes from the scene after Sarah has kicked Hagar and Ishmael out of the family community. Abraham gives Hagar and Ishmael a small amount of supplies and sends them off into the wilderness. Those supplies run out, and Hagar sets her son down under a bush and goes away a distance so that she doesn't have to watch her son perish. And as the reality of how bad things are is really setting in for her because she has no resources to help save herself or her son, she begins to sob. And we see that God responds to the cries of her son. And he comes to Hagar and he says, hey, what's going on? Why are you crying? And then he reveals a water source. And we see that Hagar is able to stay with her son until she is able to find him a wife. And so with that and with that narrative, it really reminds me again as I think back on my own lineage and thinking about the sacrifices that women made when they were attempting to survive slavery, attempting to survive atrocities that had come. And it brings out one of my favorite points from the text of Terror, where we see that Hagar is foreshadowing Israel's future in bondage, while Sarah is foreshadowing Egypt's oppression. However, in this particular narrative, we see that God has sided with the oppressors. Hagar will not experience the liberation that she seeks. She will not have her Exodus moment. She will only have exile and rejection. And so with that, we see this really hard point to contend with of where is Hagar's saving other than depending on the people around her, hoping that they will do the right thing, which sometimes they do and definitely sometimes they don't. And so I think this is so important for us to really wrestle with and really talk through and really think about, because as the text of Terror will say, to neglect the theological challenge that Hagar's narrative presents is to falsify the faith. So as you think about what Hagar meant and what her story means and how you connect with it, I implore you to ask, what is Hagar's story telling you? How do you connect with it? And how do you think that it is meant to impact your life and how you move forward? Just some things to think about. Bye.